Eventually, I was told my father also died by suicide 3 months prior to my brother. What I learned was when it comes to suicide, the right reaction was shame. When people asked me how my brother died, I remember saying it was Michigan, it was cold, and he died in a car. Everything I said was true. I just omitted some facts. And at some point, I realized, no, I have to start talking about it. Going from talking about it to making a film about it is quite a leap. We need to hear about the people who have been on the edge and what led them to the edge. And more importantly, what led them off the ledge, or now that they're off the ledge, how are they staying off?
Dear Family is a podcast hosted by Rachel Steinman, a writer, an educator, and a mental health advocate. And Rachel gets us up close and personal, so we feel a strong connection, familiarity, and comfort with her guests. So settle in and join us as we search for true healing and journey with Rachel and her most interesting guests.
Welcome everyone to another episode of Dear Family. Can you believe it's been 7 months since we entered into social and physical isolation? In some ways, it feels longer. And with anxiety and depression and suicide continuing to rise, there is no doubt that we need to talk about and take care of our mental health more than ever. And my next guest, Lisa Klein, she is doing just that through documentary filmmaking. I want to encourage you to find connection with your dear family and friends, and that's what I love about podcasts. It really does feel very intimate. So remember the things that make you smile and bring you joy, like music and nature and our exercise and our pets and good meals and hobbies and even podcasts. Thank you so much for listening and writing those awesome 5-star reviews and subscribing and following me on all the platforms at Right Now Rachel. That's right with a W. And just a little FYI, my Wi-Fi cut out a bit while I was recording this interview, and that's just, again, part of the pandemic and having everyone home and streaming while they're on Zooms. I think I was able to take care of most of it in the editing. Without further ado, stay tuned. Lisa Klein grew up in Michigan. When she was in college, she got a call to come home because her dad had died. She was told from heart failure. Months later, after her brother took his life in the car in the garage, she found out it was by suicide. And then she'd later find out that his method of suicide was the same way that her dad and her grandmother had taken their lives. Her mother made it evident, never discuss suicide out loud because it was so shameful. And she felt the same way until one day she decided to talk about it not only openly, but make documentary films about the taboo subject of mental illness and suicide, humanizing the topics. Lisa is an award-winning director and writer who's dedicated to crafting groundbreaking documentary features. Her current project, The S Word, is a documentary that tackles one of the most cloistered issues of our time through emotional stories of suicide attempts and loss survivors. In 2012, Lisa co-directed the award-winning film Of Two Minds, which is a journey into the lives of bipolar disorder. She tours the country speaking and using her films to raise awareness of mental health issues. She's the co-founder with her husband, Doug Blush, of MadPix Films, which is an LA-based production company that's dedicated to producing character-driven stories that create global impact and social change. She is a graduate of the University of Michigan, and she received an MFA from the University of Southern California. Her daughter is now a University of Michigan student. She's picked up a pandemic hobby of painting and creating art projects, which besides her family, her dog, and exercise, brings her a lot of joy. Welcome, Lisa. I'm going to just start with a little personal anecdote. A mutual now friend of mine, but a good friend of yours, Terry Cheney, who I had the wonderful privilege of interviewing, said I absolutely had to have you on this podcast. And this was around December. We ended up meeting in Silver Lake, and I discovered that we had daughters at the same school. Now, granted, they were in different grades, but we also discovered that we have a very unfortunate family legacy of multiple suicides.
And I've never met anyone that has as many family suicides as myself. I was really intrigued and interested in talking to you. Now your daughter has graduated and is in college and is going to University of Michigan, where I know you went and where you grew up. Were you able to take her in this time of remote learning?
2020, graduating
Yes.
in 2020, starting college in 2020. Everybody has a story. Everybody has stuff, but oh geez. To answer your questions, both my husband and I and Madeline flew to Michigan. We flew to Detroit last week, tested before and then tested again yesterday. And we're okay. She had a test too. There were some schools in Michigan that shut down, and we were secretly, not so secretly, hoping that Michigan would as well. Literally up until that morning, I was ready to abort the mission. But it happened and we went with it. And now I really am hoping that it lasts. But it was definitely a fraught thing because there was so much other stuff going on. Flying became kind of the back burner. So with our face shields, we just persevered and it was pretty civilized. We did see family socially distant with masks because we were there already. And then we took her. They give you 1 hour to move in. Nobody did that. It takes longer to move a kid into a dorm.
Absolutely.
She didn't really want me to cry and embarrass her, but I did. And so, yeah, I mean, I waited.
I'll be that person too. I'm already crying.
I waited till she turned around and walked away. And just to see the kid, oh my God. Under the best of circumstances, it's sad. Your kid is leaving. And then in these circumstances, aside from the fact that she was here for 5.5 months, we're all in this house and her summer plans, all of the stuff didn't happen. So we were all together and sending a kid off to COVID University.
I wish her and you and all of our kids good luck.
Yep.
This is truly unprecedented. Because this is a podcast called Dear Family, I always love to start by having my guests share a little bit about their family.
My husband is a documentary filmmaker, editor, and professor at USC, which he's teaching as we speak online. They completely shut down. He edited Of Two Minds, one of our films. Working with him was mixed. Filming on set was great because of the trust and the editing part of it, which is his thing. Me in the editing room of something so personal was sometimes emotional, but he put up with it. I told you a little bit about Madeline going to college. All of her friends wanted to go away. Her mind was pretty made up to go, and it was quite a decision. I don't know what I would have done if it wasn't Michigan, where I'm from, and there was a lot of backup and a lot of, if anything happens, we got her covered. That helped a lot.
Before we get into talking about your work and your projects, let's talk a little bit more about your family. Like you, I also have multiple suicides and mental illness in my family. Sometimes having discussions about the methodology can be triggering, but I think that this is a safe place to talk about it. I do think it's interesting to hear some of the details if you feel comfortable talking about your family's suicides. Can you tell us about your mother and your father, Harold, and your brother Keith's suicide?
To acknowledge what you said, we're members of a club. Nobody wants to be a member.
Right.
And there is a deeper understanding and empathy for sure. Everybody's story is different, but there is this very unfortunate bond. Death is death. The person's gone. We'll never see them again. But there is something about suicide, whether it's not accepting it at first because of the shame or not knowing or just so many things. When I was 8, right before my 9th birthday, my grandmother died. I was told it was a heart attack. That was the story. When I was a sophomore in college, right before my 19th birthday, and my parents were coming to take me to dinner for my birthday. I got a call from a neighbor person who was not like a good friend. It was just weird. And she's like, you should come home. And the whole thing made zero sense. First of all, she was a year younger than me. She can't tell me what to do. And the whole thing was like, why? Really? What about my dad? The whole way home, I vacillated between my dad must have had a heart attack or maybe he's dead. Like, I didn't know why. All the cars were there. All these people visiting. But then it was like, oh God, what if they're sitting shiva? I remember running to my house, to my door. Nobody was home. Everybody was 2 doors down at another unfamiliar neighbor of my family. Everybody was there. And So my dad had died. I knew that he died in the garage, but his heart stopped. I was told it was a heart attack. Same with my grandmother. It was horrible. It was the first non-grandparent death. I went back to school 2 months later, and then in January, I got a call from my sister to come home. She told me that my brother died by suicide. So that was, wow. I had stopped eating. I didn't go back to school for a while. Everything was just a mess. And then eventually I was told my father also died by suicide 3 months prior to my brother. All these years, when I was a kid, I would go to my grandparents, my mother's parents, every Friday. We would do one-act plays. And I remember playing it out in my head. That Friday night before my grandmother died, I didn't go because I was having a birthday party. I had all this guilt because I wasn't there. And I gone, she'd still be alive. I found out a couple years after my grandmother died by suicide. And yes, it was the same way. It was all in the garage. And my mom is the one who found my dad. I don't know who found I assume it was my grandfather. My mom had driven in and saw my dad. And then 3 months later, she saw my brother. It was all kind of pieced together. What I learned was when it comes to suicide, the right reaction was shame. When people asked me how my brother died, I remember saying it was Michigan. It was cold. And he died in a car. Everything I said was true. I just omitted some facts. And at some point, I realized, no, I have to start talking about it. Going from talking about it to making a film about it is quite a leap.
Your grandma, your dad, and your brother all died in the garage in their car. When Sylvia Plath died, they changed the type of gas that was pumped into people's homes. And in the TV series 13 Reasons Why, a teenage girl who slits her wrist, in a way, it kind of glamorized the act just by showing it. And I know that 2 months later, Netflix thankfully pulled that scene down.
They never had the suicide prevention number up.
It's unbelievable. They glamorized it. And it's remarkable that all these teenagers copycatted it. So speaking of copycat, it is a true phenomenon. Do you think that was at all related to your family?
Honestly, I don't know. I'm writing about it. Like with my brother, did my father dying give him permission? Because he had been struggling with depression. If I were speculating and guessing in terms of how they died, I don't know. Before we did the S word, I was pretty fascinated with methodology in terms of what does that mean? What does jumping off a building mean versus taking pills quietly versus jumping off a bridge? I do think that it has to do with who you are and what the method is. The idea of trying to mitigate taking the pills out of the house, taking the guns away. I could go on and on for a million, billion reasons. Putting a net up on the Golden Gate Bridge, I think are critical. They're super, super important. There's data that says if you try it a certain way, that is your way. But then again, we don't know. What I learned in making the film, and that's why the idea of methods, what is that benefit? If it leads kind of thing, like, oh, such and such jumped off or did this, or, well, God, if jumping off a bridge or using a gun, that's so much more impactful than taking pills. Like, no, and no. I mean, if you have an intent to die, whether you end up dying by suicide or you attempted suicide, it's the same thing. It's something that's going on with you that brought you to that point. And when I say it's the same thing in terms of the intent, the result is not the same. If somebody does attempt and survive, their stories are extremely important, which is why we tried to document as many as we could.
Your sister was diagnosed with having bipolar disorder. You're unsure if her death was an accidental overdose by alcohol poisoning, which was listed on her death certificate, or if maybe she really intended.
When you hear about somebody who died by suicide, oftentimes it's, oh, no way. That person never would have, because we don't know what somebody is internally struggling with. But I spoke with my sister that morning. Like when I heard about my brother who had been struggling, it wasn't a complete shock. With my father, I was gobsmacked because I didn't even know he was dealing with anything. Pieces started coming together later, but But with my sister, who said she would never do something like that while her son was alive, I have to believe it was an accidental overdose, but it may not.
But then again, bipolar people are very likely to attempt suicide.
If they're in a mixed state.
Exactly.
Right.
You were told your dad died of a heart attack, and you knew that your brother was dealing with depression, and you had mentioned that he joined Scientology, but no one ever talked about suicide. And how awful for your mom to have found them both. What an awful thing to go through. And also, her mom died by suicide, and she never discussed it. Clearly, these were deep, shameful family secrets. And yet, your mom was a writer, and she had a column, and she created a public narrative, but she never spoke about it. And before she passed away from cancer, was there ever a time that she discussed it with you?
Let me just say, I loved her. She was an amazing human being in so many ways, but what I've learned, coping mechanisms are your sort of toolbox to deal with things. Everybody's very different. For me, I have to talk about it, whether it's writing about it, doing a documentary. For my mother, it was, I don't want to say denial as much as shutting down and not talking about it. I brought up my brother, and she said, I can't say his name. And it wasn't that she wasn't thinking about him all the time. And she would well up. She would start to cry. And with my dad, the one thing she did say to me was, I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to hate him. I said, this doesn't make me hate him. The way she dealt with this was, this is family shame. And even though she wrote about stuff, sometimes personal-ish, when I say personal, it's like, oh, my first day of school, or when I went to camp and they came on visiting day and I hid in the laundry room, like silly families. She controlled the narrative. So she could talk about what she wanted to talk about. She wrote an incredibly beautiful eulogy for my sister. She didn't for my dad, and she didn't write anything for my brother that I remember because she couldn't. I don't remember her being able to really talk or function for months. But with my sister, it was different, and she was able to talk about that, but not she died. It was just more, she fought so hard. She was such an incredible mother.
You contemplated why both your siblings dealt with mental health issues, and I know that your nephew also contemplates the same thing. So here's the big nature versus nurture question that we all grapple with. Do you think that it was just a genetic lottery, or do you think it was because of something else?
I'm grappling with that. There's the whole thing about resilience. I have to believe that it was my friends, my community, my people. It wasn't like my father didn't have that or my brother didn't have that, but I don't know. My brother was the golden boy, an incredible athlete, super humble. But something happened. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I was really scared because I'm like, this is going to happen to me. It isn't like it doesn't occur to me every now and then, like, oh my God, how am I going to handle this and all of that? I wish that I could say that I'm just this superhero who can deal with it. It's so not true. It's just, this is the way that it had to be. With my mom, having dealt with every pillar of her family, it's like, am I going to do that? No, I can't do this to my daughter. I don't want to. I want to be here, COVID or no COVID.
One thing that I've learned through my journey is that my mom's behaviors really are an imbalance in her brain. Fortunately, you don't have bipolar. Your sister did. Your coping mechanism is, as a documentarian, to shine a light on it and talk about it, which is so healthy. And you're shining this bright light on the harsh truth so that we can be open to the reality and have these discussions. I watched Of Two Minds, which explores the struggles and successes of three people living with bipolar disorder. It's about complicated families and it combines inspiration and education. The listeners can stream it on Amazon, and it's also available in educational distribution. Your most recent documentary, The S Word, is fantastic. I was so honored to watch it, and it's also available in educational distribution distribution and it's coming soon to Amazon.
To find out when it's going to be on Amazon, go to our website, theswordmovie.com.
I will have that in the show notes. You made the S word with your husband. The S stands for suicide. You not only profiled survivors, you profiled loved ones who have lost people to suicide. And I really was so moved by it. You humanized a very difficult subject. There was one mother who lost her son, and she basically said, you have a choice. Let it destroy you or rebuild your life. And you did not let it destroy you. You found a voice as a documentarian. Can you tell us why having these stories is so humanizing and why connecting with others is so powerful?
It was really important for me to deal with bipolar for sure. I just didn't think it had been dealt with before. We had a family in there who lost their daughter to suicide, and I thought, okay, we did this. We can walk away. After about 3 seconds, I realized, no, I haven't. As a family member, it's super important because not only bearing witness, but really feeling it through the person who's still there is really, really important. When I set out to do the S word, because my experience was having lost people to suicide, that's what I thought the film was going to be. And it wasn't that people attempted and survived. It just wasn't my story and it wasn't my experience. And once I started, when I talked to Desiree and I started talking to people in the film, I realized, wow, there's this rising group of people who are speaking, they're telling their stories, and this is a piece that's been missing. We need to hear about the people who have been on the edge and what led them to the edge, and more importantly, what led them off the ledge, or now that they're off the ledge, how are they staying off of there? And all of that just became so important. And we interviewed psychiatrists and psychologists and authors. We had 300 hours worth of footage. We do this thing on our website called The S Word Stories. A lot of the stuff that didn't make it into the movie, we showed clips and we continue to. And to me, it's those stories that are life-saving. I hate to use something so big, but in so many ways, I mean, very life-affirming. It's the stories that people like Jean Toe, who you had mentioned, who lost her son to suicide. She's an activist. She's somebody I bonded with almost immediately because I thought of my mother. Her mother, again, an incredible human being. There's no way she could have done this. There's no way she could have spoken publicly about my brother. Maybe now, I do wonder now, would she be proud of me or mad at me? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I know what I hope, but she could be really pissed off that I'm here talking about all of this stuff. But I also think the human side of her humanity would have said, this is okay. But talking to Jean, that's her coping mechanism and her survival technique. She goes out there and she talks to the community, stories that she knows. She's been there.
Generations past, they didn't talk about these things because it really, truly was so shameful. And you and I both really loved Mimi Galvin in Robert Kolker's book, The Hidden Valley, how Mimi Galvin, she ended up changing her mind. Here's a woman who had 12 children. 6 of them had schizophrenia, and she couldn't admit that her kids were sick because of the shame of how it looked to her as a mom. Now we're talking about mental health so much more openly. Like today on the news, every other thing Joe Biden spoke about was mental health. I was so pleased to hear it. I do think that if your mom was in a different generation, if my grandparents had been a different generation, I just have to hope that that shame and that stigma would be not so harsh. And I do think that your mom would be proud of you.
Well, as I'm guessing your mother is of you for what
you.
You're doing.
Yeah, at first she was not happy about me sharing her story so publicly, but now she has said to me, and I'm very grateful for it, she said, if you can help one person, then I'm happy. According to the CDC, in 2018, 1.4 million people in the US attempted suicide. That's a lot. That's a big number. Now, in time of COVID, 1 in 4 people in the US are experiencing depression, which is 3 times what it was before COVID. That is also really, really hard to believe, but not that unexpected because we're all feeling anxious and we're all feeling the social isolation and worried about finances, worried about our kids, all these things. Why is it so important to show portraits of people that have survived suicide?
Being on a rudderless ship, I won't get into politics, but having zero leadership, I just got into politics, is unnerving to say the least. At first, it was kind of like, oh, we're all in this together, which no, we may all be in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And I didn't make that up. I thought it was a great analogy too. Somebody's on their yacht in the middle of the thing and somebody else is in there's a hole in it. So no. But at first it did feel that way. Like at first it was like, oh, I'm isolated at home. I've always been isolated at home. I can't go out of my house anyway. And I'm feeling really low and I don't have a job. Oh, look at all these other people. Not that it's misery loves company, but it's misery loves company-ish. And so there's that. It isn't surprising that 6 months in, we're like, when is this going to end? How is this going to end? Seeing people going through the worst moments of their lives and seeing that they have survived and how they have survived and that they're talking about it and that they're living it. And here they are. They now have children or a relationship, whatever it is that's keeping them here. Hearing the stories of people who have lost people to suicide is really important too, because there is the statistic, and maybe my brother does or does not fit into that. When you lose somebody to suicide, your chances go up. Yourself will be somebody who dies by suicide or attempts. And so to be able to hear about people who have survived that, losing somebody to it, and how you can move forward. Again, everybody's story is different. There's the person who, if you run and eat kale and quinoa, you're going to do great and you're going to survive and you're going to feel good all the time. Well, you might not like that. It really is helpful for you to play piano or to write about it or to talk about it or whatever it may be. And same with having lost somebody. I had to respect my mother's way of dealing with it because she survived all of that. And having cancer and all of that is not shocking if we think of things like cancer, of having the mind-body connection. It just seems to me that having the stories out there for somebody to watch, but also for somebody like Terry who can write so beautifully and who can tell her story in such a way. When I read Manic, that's why I wanted her for the film, just the way she articulates it. She said when she writes this stuff, catharsis is such a weird thing because people have asked me, was it cathartic to make the movie? I don't know if it suddenly I feel better. It isn't that so much. It just needs to flow that way. Like Terry needs to write.
There's that coping mechanism idea, the connections of seeing others and knowing that you're not alone and that there are survivors is helpful. Kids nowadays have on their back of their student IDs on many of the schools I've been to and my own kids, they have the suicide hotline on the back now. And I know that mental health is being discussed in high school and college, and there's a lot of facilities for our kids now, more than ever. But we also know that suicide is the second leading cause of death for 15 to 24-year-olds.
The idea of talking about this, it's like, oh my God, if you bring it up, somebody's want to do it. It's like, okay, there's this person going through their life, everything's great. And then they had heard a lecture on suicide. It's like, oh, suicide, now that you mention it, maybe I'll try that. No, it doesn't work that way at all. The idea of FOMO, it's like, oh my God, wait, they're in Hawaii. They're having a great time. Look at her figure. I stayed home and ate snacks over spring break. That's not fair. She has a boyfriend. I don't. Yeah. Everybody knows what everybody's doing all the time. He didn't invite me. I don't want to be the person of my generation blaming social media because you can't blame that. But something like social media, like Facebook or Twitter or TikTok or whatever, if we can turn those things around and use them for good, the potential is so good. In our film, we highlighted Live Through This. It's their Facebook groups and a website. They're portraits of people who have attempted suicide and survived, and you read their stories. Things like that are really helpful and great. What kids are going through now versus what they were going through when I was 13 or 14. It's just different. I don't know that it's better or worse, but I can't imagine living online all the time.
My husband calls it the fire hose of information coming at you all the time. And our kids, they're not going outside and playing and being bored and letting their mind rest. I am really glad you brought that point up. If you're concerned about someone that may be thinking about suicide, you don't have to worry about asking them. You're not going to suddenly plant a seed. But I also do appreciate the title of your movie, the S word, because people are afraid to talk about it and say it. It's such a taboo subject, so deeply personal, because you're trying to end your life. And when you do it, you're alone. And yet our loved ones are the ones that are left behind grieving, and they can feel so much guilt and question. How can we prevent suicide? By having this difficult conversation with someone you're worried about. And then conversely, if you're suicidal, how do you bring it up to a loved one?
It's a tough thing. I was traveling with the film and people asking those questions, and the idea of, what if I say the wrong thing? What do I say? The thing that I learned from people a lot wiser than me is that it isn't what you say, it's listening to what is going to help them, as opposed to telling them what's going to help them. What is going to make you want to wake up tomorrow morning? If you get the answer, nothing, you have to keep going and you have to keep listening. Knowing that somebody cares, knowing that you're not alone and that somebody is there for you is really, really, really important. Will there be people who, no matter what you do and how much you're there, there are people who still die by suicide? Unfortunately, yes. But can you mitigate those numbers by really being there and listening? I think you can. If I didn't believe that, I don't think we'd be talking now. I don't think I would have made the film. Being able to tell somebody that they're feeling a certain way, the only way they can do that is if they know that it's going to be received open-heartedly. Just like when you tell your daughter or your son or anybody, talk to somebody. No, it isn't just talk to somebody. You talk to somebody who is not going to judge you. It might be one person out of all your friends who is the person that you can talk to. The trusted adult truly is the trusted adult, not the person who's say, oh boy, well, we're going to have to hospitalize you tomorrow or whatever. No. And the other thing I think that's really important is the idea of the secret, where they tell their best friend and they're like, whatever you do, don't tell somebody. Because if you would rather your friend be mad at you or be dead, you make a decision. When I say a trusted adult, I don't mean somebody who's not going to tell you. I mean somebody who's going to listen and who's going to listen again and who's going to be there for you and is going to help you figure out what your survival techniques are going to be, what's going to keep you wanting to be here, having a quality of life and figuring out what's going to make you thrive as opposed to just stay alive.
In the S word, you profile a woman named Anne, and she's a mother who is a suicide survivor, and she lives in this beautiful home in Palos Verdes with her very sweet and handsome son who clearly loves and supports her. And I really appreciated that, because from the outside, people sometimes think people have it all. And how can she be depressed? And so that was, I think, very poignant. And then you also profile a Black woman,
Kelechi,
yes. She makes us aware of how there's a lot of shame and stigma in the Black community. And she mentions a hashtag, suicide so white. I've also heard that the suicide rate for the Black community has doubled just in the past few years. How do we get this conversation going, especially in communities of people of color, so that hashtag suicide prevention is not so white?
Situation that you're trying to deal with, and everybody who's talking to you or at you is not you by any stretch, it's going to be a lot harder. In fact, Kelechi and I are doing a virtual screening and a Q&A to a community of color at the end of the month. And we've done a few. She's doing a lot of it herself, talking to people. I think people need to step up within their own communities. There is one representative that I know of who talks about the Native American community, talking to people and relating to people who you understand what their circumstances are. I mean, you want to be able to talk to everybody and anybody, but to really relate to somebody, it is important. And it's a matter of people willing to go into this line of work. Black lives shouldn't just matter during Black History Month and after George Floyd gets killed, just like September is Suicide Prevention Month. Doesn't mean that we don't talk about it in October and April. It has to be integrated. It has to diversify.
We need more cultural representation, more cultural sensitivity in the mental health field. There are people who don't want to die, but they want to severely hurt themselves. And I always think about my mom, who is so fearful of dying by skin cancer or dying by some ailment, and she's the first to go to the doctor, and yet she's contemplated suicide. Why do you think that suicide is so irrational?
I asked this question, did you really want to die or did you want the pain to end? And I think it's much more about wanting the pain to end. It's like, I don't want to wake up tomorrow morning feeling the way that I feel right now. I can't imagine another day like that. Or you look at somebody like a veteran or somebody who is in the Army or the Marines or in the military, and they don't want to die. They're in a survival mode. Then they come home and their job is no longer, they'll be lucky to get a job at Target. Not to say that that's a bad job, but when your job was about risking your life and saving lives, and then suddenly it's something else, it's like, how do I deal with that? But you were somebody who did not want to die and you wanted to save other people and all of that. And then suddenly it's, how do I cope with this?
It's really interesting, which brings me to the idea of bipolars that are in mixed states. It can be literally the matter of a phone call stopping them from forward motion, which is why it's so important to check on even our strong friends. Anthony Bourdain's suicide really hit me hard. I adore him, and so did my husband. And in my mind, he seemed to have this great life. It doesn't feel rational to an outside person. You've brought your documentaries all over the world, and you've done presentations in places like Macedonia and Lithuania. And now because of COVID, you're using Zoom, and you're going to be going into Kazakhstan and speaking to their schools and their communities after showing them your movie and having Q&As. How is suicide seen internationally?
I talk about shame and stigma. When we were in Lithuania, we had the opportunity to talk to a lot of high school students. I went with Craig Miller, who was also in the film, who's incredible. And he's out there all the time talking about it, telling his story. He's got the crowd crying and doing the thing. We had somebody come up to us who had not come out yet, and he was thinking about coming out to his family and knew he would probably get kicked out of his house. So you're talking about shame upon shame upon shame, being who you are. There are some countries where suicide is against the law. Going to other countries and learning about their cultures and talking about what we're doing and to know that we too are going through stuff and this is the way we're dealing, being able to exchange stories and know that is something that does not discriminate. It doesn't matter what part of the world you're from. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is or your religion or how much money you have, your TV star, none of that matters. Suicide is probably the only thing left that does not discriminate. You don't know what's going on with somebody. When somebody who dies by cancer and they struggled for years and then somebody dies by suicide, oh, well, they gave up. No, generally you're talking about somebody who has struggled for years and years and years, and they just couldn't do it anymore. There's such a lack of understanding.
Why are purpose and hope the antidote to suicide?
Purpose is why you wake up in the morning. It's the antidote to a lot of things. You know that you have a reason for being here. And also you're not the center of your own universe. Other people are relying on you. You can look at it as pressure, or you can look at it as like, okay, this is what I've got to do. And if you don't have hope, it's kind of like, yeah, this is what I got to do, but it's not going to make a difference. Then what's the point of the purpose. It's in conjunction with each other. But it's probably good to have a little bit of, I don't want to say cynicism, but an understanding, because otherwise you're really going to flip every time something doesn't go the way you think it's going to go or that you hope it's going to go. It's finding that balance.
When you were 20, we now know that you were at University of Michigan and your dad and your brother had passed away. If you could write your younger 20-year-old self a Dear Lisa love letter, knowing what you know now, what would you have told yourself?
That's a great question. Something that I've asked people, and it's easier to ask somebody. I wish that I had come to the realization that it's okay to be who I am, and it's okay to have my past and to be proud of my father, to be proud of my brother, to be proud of who they were. Because you hear, oh, that person must have been such a coward. I don't know that I ever thought of my father as a coward, but now I get to think, wow, how brave. He was 54. However many years, I didn't know that there was something going on. To come that far, that my brother could come that far, my grandmother, to be able to do that, to appreciate what people are going through to get to that point, and to also be able to say, this is who I am, and this was my brother, and this was my dad, and they were amazing people. And let's talk about their lives rather than their deaths. And what can we learn from them? I wish that some of the stuff that I'm doing now, I was able to find that place. And I do wish that I could have reached my mother and been able to say, you're an amazing woman, and none of this has anything to do with you. Because that's the other thing that I think people who lost people to suicide share is this, what did I miss? What didn't I do? What could I have said? What could I have done? And maybe there is something. Maybe we could have done something that day. But what about the next day? What about the day after that? What about the following week? To personalize it to such a point where it wasn't about me and that I did the best I could. I just wish I could have come to that place a lot sooner, but I don't know that I could have, because I was young and a self-absorbed college student when everything was about me.
It sounds like your journey was to find that compassion for your dad and your mom and your brother and yourself. And that's actually my journey as well. It's very freeing when you can look at your loved ones who suffered and be able to see them as strong as opposed to the other way. When my grandpa first died and I was 16, I remember thinking, why on earth would somebody ever do that? Something so selfish. How could he do that to his family? Now I look at it so differently. So I really do relate to that. Last question, Lisa. What do you do that brings you happiness? And do you have any happiness habits?
My family, for sure. My daughter, my husband, her being away takes the quotient down a little bit. My dog is a huge part. Writing, my friends. I started painting, not houses, art stuff, and I've never felt like I was that person or good at it at all. I started painting and realizing, I kind of suck at this. So I started collaging over it. Cut to now, I converted my daughter's playroom to an art studio, and I went to Blick and bought all these canvases. It's been great. It's been super distracting. It isn't like anyone's going to think I'm good or that I'm an artist all of a sudden. I'm a dilettante. So I can be not so good. Like, it doesn't matter. It's not like I go and do something and, oh my God, it just better be brilliant. But when I write, I put that pressure on myself. And when I do this, I don't. And playing tennis and running.
Oh, that's great. I am going to get a picture of your artwork and I'll put that in the show notes. That's so great that you found a new joy in your life. That's inspirational. I will have links in the show notes to your website so people can hear the other stories, and links to both of your documentaries. I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me and opening up, and for all you're doing.
Well, thank you for what you're doing too. You talked to two of my favorite authors.
It's been a really great ride for me, and I get to meet people like you. It's a big plus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Lisa. I look forward to seeing you again in person.
Let's go back to squirrel.
Exactly.
Okay.
That'd be great. Okay,
right.
bye.
Bye.
This is Rachel Steinman. For more information or to contact me with any questions, comments, or guest ideas, please check out rightnowrachel.com. That's right with a W. Thank you so much for listening, subscribing, and sharing, dear family. And if you found value in what you've just heard, I would love and so appreciate a great review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, I wish you love, happiness, and good mental health.